Understanding human anatomy and human proportions is an essential skill for any artist who is interested in representing figures within their artwork. That being said, drawing someone isn't always a perfectly curated space where we get to draw someone seated for several hours. That being said, taking on the challenge of drawing people around you on a day-to-day basis is a great way to not only enhance your anatomy skills, but your observational skills of material and clothing, and also understanding the proportional values of various poses, whether someone is seated or walking. Furthermore, it is also important to understand how these very specific poses are defined or contextualized by the surrounding environment. So now that we know what is in store for today, hey guys, my name is Matt. Welcome to another video by artincontext.org, where we explore a variety of different art related topics. And in today's video, we will be looking at some fundamental key concepts and ideas on how to approach drawing a person. So with that being said, let's get into it. Now, in order to know how to draw a person correctly, we need to know that the human body is comprised of a certain number of segments. However, it is essential to note that these segments can change according to body types, and when bodies are in different postures and poses, naturally the body will distort. But that being said, these proportions are to be used as a guideline to either follow or deviate from. But naturally, we'll find that when we start drawing people in various poses, whether it's seated or walking, we'll find that we will often have these subtle distortions. Now, the first thing we want to look at is we want to look at male proportions, and we can define this as a structure that is broken up into 8 equally segmented portions. Now, this means that we can kind of understand this by creating this diagrammatical drawing, which we can establish by using a ruler to draw a vertical line, and then you can divide that vertical line into 8 equal increments. Now, this is basically going to segment the body into different parts, but what you can do is you can look at a video that we have released that kind of dives deep into proportional values for both the female and male figure, and kind of see how the human body is broken up into these 8 equal sections for both the male and female body. So once we understand these basic proportional values in terms of how to represent a figure within a drawing using this diagrammatical method, we can play around with scale in terms of making a taller or shorter female figure, maybe a slightly larger male or female figure. It's really up to you. But then the next thing we want to think through is how we manipulate the measurements for different poses. Now, again, these measurements should not be held as a hard and fast rule to stick to, but rather as a loose guideline to help establish correct sizes in form. And then once you understand the basic measurements, you can therefore, or from there, kind of break away from it, change them, manipulate them as suggested previously in terms of creating a variety of different poses. Now, for instance, you can utilize this measurement as a way of comparing lengths of different body parts. So by understanding the different lengths of the body parts, you can kind of form figures in different poses and kind of bend that vertical line that establishes the human figure in these 8 equal segments in a way that represents a seated pose or a walking pose or a leaning pose. And again, you can apply these concepts to a variety of different poses, and then from there it's a matter of building up your figure, whether it is in their body and then ultimately their clothing, and slowly refine your sketch of a person within a specific space. Now, utilizing the measurements as a guiding principle, you can then also create base layers for different figures. So this can help you establish more complex body positions and angles, such as someone may be seated on the floor with their elbow resting on the knee. So thinking through these more complex figures and kind of using these guidelines to establish those complex skeletal structures for those figures is another way to kind of utilize this method of approaching figure drawing. Now, it's important to remember that the body proportions will always change when you are drawing figures from perspectives. So the proportional guideline should be used to set a ghost skeleton figure of lines that simply establish flow and form, which then can be drawn over or again refined with a little bit more of an accurate body positioning. Now, you'll find that as you get more comfortable with the basic guidelines, you can start using them more loosely as if you're creating a skeleton to be sketched over. And this is really helpful for establishing more realistic figures or realistic movements within figures. In many ways, a person drawing is also about about capturing the unique aspects of a person. So this includes not only poses, but posture, clothing, and this also helps you understand how clothing can therefore be formed around this structure or how it falls on the structure. So this means that when you want to draw someone from life, you can then build them up from these proportional guidelines to their body parts and eventually their clothing as this last layer as you build up your drawing. Once you have parts of the body, you can then naturally construct them in different environments and therefore the clothing and how the clothing falls. So having the proportional components of a human figure drawn within a specific environment helps to establish how the clothing will form around the body, and figuring out the proportions gives you a lot of freedom to play around with sketching the person in a variety of different ways. So you can play around with this concept of building up these figures through these guidelines using this scale. Again, you can look at the link below in terms of how to understand proportional values of a person in a deeper way on a video that kind of focuses specifically on that. But ultimately, you are essentially starting with an accurately measured figure, which provides you with a better chance of placing the surrounding environment more correctly within your drawing, and this includes clothing, chairs, cars, nature, whatever else the figure is interacting with, and naturally the clothing that they wear. Now, as you build up your confidence with these fundamental concepts and key principles, you can practice some loose figure drawings using these simple guideline skeletons to draw figures on the move in real life. But as you get used to these guidelines can then be drawn quite quickly, especially when you're trying to capture figures in real life that are moving and you don't really have a lot of time. You can work with these guidelines to capture the essential qualities, and then using your memory you can kind of slowly integrate the rest of the features and contextualizing details of that specific figure that you remember or that you saw, and naturally this is where you can build up a drawing, and this is really good for just practicing observational skills, memory, and using these guidelines for your own figure drawing or person drawing. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to kind of apply these concepts, and this is where we can actually look at a more step-to-step process of how to draw a person or various types of people. And the first thing we want to do is we want to think about how we can utilize the basic fundamental concepts once again in some of our own person sketches, where we can explore different poses and postures, specifically with a more loose approach in terms of representing figures that we see on a daily basis. Learning how to sketch a figure from the mind is also a great practice and enhances your awareness of actual figure formations in real life. So let's see how we can use these basic drawing processes and apply it to some of our own figure drawings in real life. Now again, the way in which we can approach this is maybe find ourselves seated somewhere where we find a lot of people or a lot of foot traffic, and this is where we can start thinking through those key guidelines and those fundamental ways of establishing segments within a figure, or understanding those segments and how to apply it quite quickly in terms of establishing these guidelines on your sketching paper, and then from there building up the sketch in terms of what you remember or what you see in the actual situation. So maybe looking at how to represent a walking figure, but again the idea is to build up your drawing in layers. So using a pencil, start by establishing a basic scale along the side of your page, breaking up the figure into 8 equal segments. From there we want to start lightly sketching the figure, placing different features in different positions, again building up that skeletal structure in terms of how the scale and positioning of these various features kind of work collectively. And once we understand that, we can then proceed to drawing over the guidelines. So this is the part where you now want to imagine clothing the figure and thinking about the actual body. So carefully considering how the clothing will fall on the body, considering the moving direction that they had and how that will inevitably pull clothing in the opposite direction. But learning how to draw clothing on a person is also a great way to learn how to capture movement and motion within a person drawing. Again, drawing people isn't just always this process of capturing a figure without these contextualizing details, but rather it is a matter of capturing the person, considering these contextualizing details and how they are kind of collectively working together to define a figure in a space. Now the idea is to also always start with a pencil, and this is where you can kind of do those quick sketches or those skeletal structures and formations of your figure, and then from there you can kind of rely more on your observational skills and memory in terms of representing details such as clothing, facial features and so on that you may have not had enough time to kind of draw then and there whilst the figure was still present. So once again, once you have established the fundamental proportions and guidelines in your person drawing, the rest is about creative interpretation, and this means their hair, face, clothing, and so on, and the rest is a matter of creative decision making. With these more loose sketches on a day-to-day basis, we'll find that in the beginning it might be a little bit difficult, but this is why drawing is a practice. It does require some practice. So you do want to be doing these sketches quite often in terms of representing or drawing figures on a daily basis, and this is why investing in a sketchbook is really useful. It's really cheap, and it's a great way to kind of enhance your observational and figure drawing skills. So, however, once you have established these fundamental skeletal proportions and movements for your figure or whatever figure you're drawing, you can then slowly build up what contextualizing details you saw. And once you have done that with a light pencil sketch, you can play around with using markers and pens, and this is where you can start integrating some shading to create structure and three-dimensionality within your figure. So this is also where shading becomes an essential tool to establish the structure and form of a figure, and this is where we want to consider the nature of light and shadow and what kind of key moments of light and shadow were represented within our figure. So when it comes to representing a figure or trying to draw a figure quite quickly with a short period of time, always consider where the light source is, always consider the time of day, always consider how that will inevitably affect the figure in motion. And naturally you can kind of trust those factors even when the figure has left the space, or if they are not present anymore whilst you are still drawing, and you can basically use those key concepts and principles as a guiding force in terms of where shadows will be represented within your figure drawing. But as you proceed with the sketching process, some key things to just think through are first establishing those fundamental skeletal structures that kind of define the proportions and scale of various features and how they are placed within that specific pose or within that figure in motion. And then from there it's a matter of building up the contextualizing details in terms of what you've seen and how to represent that as best you can. And this is where we can start thinking about working in some shading and ultimately bringing some more three-dimensionality to our figure drawing. Now, naturally, once we have gotten comfortable, we can start applying these concepts to all sorts of figures and looking at both male structures and female structures and how they are interacting with the environments around them is a great way to, again, enhance your understanding of anatomy, especially how certain male and female anatomical structures kind of shift the way clothing forms around them, and also their clothing choice, and so on and so on. So shifting from either female or male structure drawing into something else, we can apply the same process. In this particular case, you can see that in this particular tutorial or in this next sketch, we are basically drawing a woman who has her arm lifted as if she's talking or kind of trying to point something out. But again, naturally the idea is the same. So this time, using the same measurements along the side of your page, we can start to work on a female figure sketch, and the idea is to kind of work through the same kind of principles in terms of measurements, guidelines, skeletal structure, and so on and so on. And this is where we can start developing the sketch once again with a loose pencil drawing process. And once we've kind of gotten comfortable with this idea of establishing those guidelines really quickly and then kind of develop a quick skeletal structure, we can simply apply the process of altering the sketch once again to that guideline drawing or that skeletal structure. So we can also slightly alter details a little more this time, and this is where we can be a little playful in terms of positioning. Again, when it comes to drawing figures, you can also change the structure of the figure. So maybe you saw a lady with her hand on her hip, but in this case you can kind of put her hand in her pocket in terms of how she interacts with clothing. Another essential thing to remember with figure drawing is that sometimes it's really fun and interesting to kind of deviate slightly from what you see directly or how it is represented in real life, and this is where we can tweak details a little bit, especially obviously if the figure has left the space in which we are positioned as we draw, and actually this is where we can change things like maybe the hip into a hand in a pocket, and so on and so on, and this can be applied to hairstyles. The main things that we are trying to work with is just understanding poses, skeletal structures, how anatomically these proportions work, and then playing around with contextualizing details is really a matter of subjective creative interpretation. So that's another thing to think about as you proceed with your drawing. But the process again is the same. We will continue to kind of draw over the guidelines, and This is why we also want to consider drawing both male and female figures, because as we proceed to draw clothing, especially in certain areas where the structure or the figure might differ, especially in the breast area, we want to make sure that we are representing shadow formations as accurately as possible to have a more accurate representation of that figure. And this is where we can consider areas such as the breast and how shadow formations kind of form underneath the breast slightly, and how that affects clothing, or near the hip area, and so on and so on. So these small details are essential in terms of a more accurate representation of the figure that you're trying to draw. And a part of this tutorial is kind of practicing these qualities of representing clothing on these various figures, and paying attention to these small details and how to define them within your drawing. So naturally, you want to take your time considering these moments as the figure moves, and then make up the skeletal structure, play around with forming the clothes as you consider these anatomical structures of both male and female figures, and how their body positions or shapes are different. And then slowly you can build up clothing and come to that last stage of integrating shading once more, to create a little bit more three-dimensionality and structure within the figure drawing and their clothing. Now again, shading will always bring the drawing to life and give it more three-dimensionality, and this is where we really want to consider light and shadow and how it is affecting the figure in a variety of different ways. And this can be in terms of shadows on the face in more subtle ways, but then obviously in the clothing and all these little details within the clothing. So we should find that naturally, as we have built up our sketch, shading is the kind of process or period or part of our sketching process where we can spend a lot of time on, because we've already established all the important details and features, and then we can just simply take our time shading them in and adding shading to give it a more realistic quality. But now we're going to move on to one more sketch, and this is where we can kind of look at something a little more unique in terms of body pose or position, and this is a seated structure or seated female figure. And again, looking at a seated figure and looking at how to distort those segments and proportions due to that skeletal formation is an interesting and unique challenge. As we kind of build up this daily practice of sketching figures, we'll find that we get so good at this quick representation of their fundamental formations in that skeletal form, and then from there we can slowly and a little more swiftly develop our sketch with these contextualizing features. So we can start by lightly sketching the figure using the measurements as a loose guideline to assist us in forming the figure in that seated position. From there we can start altering the sketch, and this is something we can play around with once again, whereby we change the perspective, and we can explore changing the body positions once again, maybe a leg up or down, an arm behind her to kind of demonstrate that she's leaning against something. So this is something we can play around with. Now obviously we can move on to then drawing over these guidelines. So once we have established the guidelines, we can then proceed by drawing over them with our pens. And as we do this, it's also important for us to kind of consider figures where they might be positioned there for a long time. So naturally you'll find that with a seated figure, most often they are there for a while, so you can spend time on capturing details a little more effectively, and ultimately focusing more on this idea of attire and clothing and how it's kind of forming around the figure. So try to explore different pieces of attire and how they can be used to suit the vibe of the person drawing. Again, we also don't always have to represent exactly what we see, but we can use that figure as a artistic inspiration for a type of drawing that we want to capture, or a vibe, or just a general personality within our figure drawing. And then lastly, what we can do is we can then use shading to create more structure and three-dimensionality, and this is again a moment where we basically try to navigate this process of imagining light source coming predominantly from one side, which ultimately affects a large portion of shadow formation in terms of where it will be consistently represented within our figure, and that is where we can kind of focus our shadow formations predominantly to one side. But again, it's just a matter of thinking through this more naturalistic representation of how light and shadow interacts with the structure, or how the structure or the figure interacts with light and shadow. But otherwise, that is it, guys. The more time you spend on this idea of building up these figure sketches or making it a daily practice, the more you'll kind of capture this idea or ingrain this idea into your brain of how to quickly make these skeletal structures in terms of people you see moving or seated or in various poses, and then kind of capturing that as quick as you can, ultimately developing that sketch into their body and then their clothing and so on and so on. And this process gets much more efficient the more you do it. So really play around with this idea of making a daily practice of it, drawing figures in different spaces, and ultimately doing this as often as you can. And slowly you'll find that your drawings start to become a little more refined, a little more detailed, a little better. And in that process, you'll find that you also start to notice things much better, so your observational skills get much better. But otherwise, some key things to think about is, number one, don't stick too much to the measurements. Again, use the measurements as this tool or this loose tool to establish a figure as quickly as you can in their skeletal structure, and then develop the sketch from there. Make sure that you really consider each stage of building up your figure through these layers, from skeletal structure to body positioning, and then ultimately to refining them by these contextualizing details. Always consider the effectiveness of shading in terms of establishing the shadow formations and how light is representing or interacting with the figure. And then the last thing is, you can also use references to build up familiarity and comfort with this drawing process. And as you do so, you can then apply these concepts to drawing people in real life and ultimately enhancing your figure drawing. But otherwise, that is it for today, guys. If you like this video, please let us know in the comment section below. If you're also interested in related topics, please also drop a like, that helps, and a subscribe that ultimately grows the channel, which enables us to make more art related content for you guys. But otherwise, thanks again for tuning in. That is it from me today. Until next time, cheers.